Notwithstanding that every political career inevitably will end in failure, what would prompt a politician to invest his entire career in pursuit of some overriding objective? What would inspire such an endeavour? The desire to make your country more influential in international affairs? Hardly hits the spot, does it? To defend democracy, to restore national sovereignty and self-government? Much more likely. When I campaigned in 1975 in the referendum to leave what was then the European Community, and again when I campaigned in 2016 in the referendum to leave the European Union, I didn't do so in order to make our country more influential in the world. I did it because I believed that the laws by which we were increasingly being governed were being made elsewhere by people we did not elect and whom we could not remove. Now, I would have been prepared to give up a measure of influence in the world, or indeed a measure of future prosperity, in order to achieve that end of returning power to elected representatives in our own country. My prejudice was that we wouldn't need to do so, and that there might even be a gain in influence and a gain in economy, even if only at the margin, and even if only over a prolonged period of time on which you could measure that. Which brings me to Chu Enlai, probably before your time. Chu Enlai was the premier of the People's Republic of China under Chairman Mao. He was responsible for ameliorating many of the most disastrous consequences of the Cultural Revolution. But in addition to being the premier, he was a great scholar of the French Revolution, having been educated at university in France. And he was asked once, what was his estimate of the consequences of the French Revolution? This would, of course, be 200 years after that revolution had taken place. And his answer, it's far too soon to tell. And I think we ought to take something of that elongated time frame in considering the effects of our having left the European Union. We gave our membership 44 years or so. We've hardly been out of it, and we've been out of it in the most unordinary of times. Within weeks of our departing from the European Union, the world economy took the greatest shock since the Second World War with the pandemic, which is still not recovered. Within weeks of our having left the European Union, there was a war in Europe that has raged for 5 years. And this, in the last year, we've seen a huge shock to the whole post-war economic environment as a consequence of the second presidency of Donald Trump. We ought to give more time in ordinary times to make an estimate of what the consequences are of our having left the European Union, if indeed ordinary times are ever to return. So, having set those two caveats, first, that it was never the intention, second, that it's far too soon to tell, I would say that I am moderately optimistic that we have seen an increase in our international influence in the world and again in economic activity. Of course, the two are closely related. Both soft and hard power are going to some extent, be a function of economic and financial clout. So, the favoured statistic for those who are most critical of our departure from the European Union is that as a consequence of our departure, our economy will be some 4% smaller than it otherwise would have been over the medium term. But the genesis of that statistic is the same Treasury forecasts in 2016 that predicted that from the moment of a referendum result to leave, we would enter a recession and there would be a loss of 10,000 jobs every month. In fact, we had growth in jobs of almost 10,000 every month, and we ended the year 2016 as the best performing developed economy. And since when, you will find that the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, who bitterly opposed Brexit and sought from 2016 to 2019 to reverse it and to have a second referendum, he boasts every day that we have the highest growth in the G7, that we have not suffered as a consequence of leaving the European Union in terms of our comparative performance with those engines of the European Union, France and Germany. So it's vitally important, I think, that we should have, as we have, re-engaged with the World Trade Organization as a country in our own right. So in this world, which is now threatened with a return to some form of mercantilism, we can evangelize for the free trading nation that we have always been. And in particular, we should have our outreach focused on the developing world, because traditionally for the last 10 years or so, we have been the second largest donor in the world. But trade dwarfs aid. It's vitally important for developing countries that they have access to our markets so they can acquire capital and develop. And that is exactly what we are now doing. Our outreach to the 65 countries that are now part of our scheme gives them much greater access to our markets than the European equivalent, and a much more flexible and liberal interpretation of rules of origin compared with the European Union. A much greater flexibility in that when we want to change it, we don't need the say-so of all 27 partners. Compare that with the customs union of which we were a member and which was designed to promote trade within the union and to disadvantage trade without it. And for so much of its history, operated together with the disastrous consequences of the common agricultural policy, which used subsidies to generate huge surpluses in Europe, which were then dumped on international markets with devastating consequences for the incomes of developing countries reliant on their primary produce. Now, it takes the European Union, it has taken the European Union between 7 and 10 years to negotiate every single trade deal that it has achieved. The Prime Minister, that opponent of Brexit, is out there now boasting of the trade deals that he has achieved within a year of coming to power. And he's right to do so. But he has done so using the power and influence that he simply wouldn't have had without Brexit. And I think our performance on trade in that way has been quite spectacular. Remember, we left the European Union with a comprehensive free trade deal with the Union. There are no tariffs, well, plenty of non-tariff barriers, but there are no tariffs. We have secured very significant concessions from the USA, and we've negotiated trade deals, free trade deals with Australia, New Zealand, Japan, India, the Gulf, Singapore, and most importantly, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Interestingly, with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a business school, a prestigious business school, not far down the road from here, produced an assessment in the middle of last year, which said that the results of our accession to the Trans-Pacific Partnership had been very modest and disappointing. That would not be surprising, given that we didn't actually accede to the partnership until the 15th day of last month. Their report went on to point to catastrophic decline in our export performance in whole categories of exports, from a relatively advantageous balance to zero. Of course, what the boffins had failed to spot was that the export codes under which they were recording the data had changed and they had simply failed to pick it up. But the Trans-Pacific Partnership with those countries which will account for 52% of the world's growth over the next 10 years will be critical in our welfare for the future. In our leadership in all sorts of subjects with the rest of the world, it hasn't diminished at all. We've had the conference on AI led by Rishi Sunak in the United Kingdom. We've had all sorts of issues with respect to a leadership role in climate change and the rest. It hasn't diminished us. But where I would say we've made the greatest impact, and it's difficult now to think about it after 5 years of attritional war in Europe, but think back to 2020 and the first days of that invasion. The expectation was that Kyiv wouldn't last the week. It was to be completely overwhelmed. And it was the flexibility and agility of the United Kingdom, freed from the common defence and security and foreign policy, and the need to get the say-so of 27 partners, that allowed us with such agility to provide the vital anti-tank capability to Kiev in those opening hours and days. It made a vital difference. And this is what the Prime Minister of Poland said. Brexit has enabled the United Kingdom to project influence in foreign affairs much more adeptly, through quick decision-making and in a very useful and honourable way. You do the right thing before others and therefore encourage the rest of us. I might say at that stage we should let our case rest. Those people who believe that influence is to be had from within the European Union underestimate its fundamentally transactional nature. I don't dispute that they are the best negotiators, but they negotiate to ensure that everything has a price and a nut. Everything has a price. When we joined the European Union, our membership fee was disproportionately higher than the other memberships, entirely as a consequence of the fact that most of our trade, 60% of it, was outside the EU. Most of our inputs were coming from outside the EU, and that had a consequence for our membership fee. And even when Margaret Thatcher, some years later, moved heaven and earth to negotiate a rebate, we were still the second highest net contributor to the European Union. But the real price of our membership at joining the European Union was whipped out almost at the last minute. There was no common fisheries policy in the European community before we joined. They created it in order to get access to our waters and our fishing waters. It was a high price to pay, but Parliament decided that it was a price worth paying. When Tony Blair went to Brussels to negotiate reforms to the monstrous excess and waste of the common agricultural policy, the relatively modest reforms that he managed to negotiate came at the cost of giving up virtually all of the rebate that Margaret Thatcher had negotiated. Everything has a price. And so the government is now negotiating a reset. And as I say, lots of things can be had from this list of wants, but all come at a price and a loss of influence. I leave it to you as students to judge whether the £500 million a year price tag of rejoining Erasmus is worth it. It may be, it may not. I think, frankly, it's a really high price to pay. Currently, we're now negotiating on the phytosanitary package, that package to try and ease the non-tariff barriers on the export of food. And it'll come at a high price. There's to be a very large exit fee should we ever change our mind and want to leave it again. Its rules will be made in Europe and we won't have any say. And we will have to give up the freedom that we acquired and now has given us a lead in the life sciences because we can do gene editing. They don't do gene editing in the European Union. If we sign up to that agreement, we will have to stop and our lead in life sciences will be sacrificed. Is it a price worth paying? Perhaps the most disappointing of the reset negotiations is that our defence industries are not going to have the ability to bid into the new European Defence Fund. The government has decided, probably rightly in my view, that the price being demanded is just too high. But the reason that we're at this point is because the government fundamentally failed to recognise the transactional nature of the negotiations that it went into. We gave away our trump card at the very start to create an atmosphere of goodwill and got nothing in return. We gave them what they wanted at the start. Strangely enough, it was 12 more years free access to our waters. As in 1973, it came back down again at the end to the fish. So, let me end as I began. The objective was never, in my view, to secure greater influence. I think we have secured greater influence, but it wasn't the objective. The objective was to be governed by people that we elect and we can remove. We might not like them, but we can remove them. I was David Cameron's parliamentary private secretary, both as Prime Minister and leader of the opposition. As a minister, I negotiated on our behalf. The engine of power in the European Union is the Council of Ministers. It meets in camera. There are no minutes, and those deals are hammered out on a transactional basis late at night. It's an exhausting process. It was always extremely difficult for us to get together a qualified majority on anything that was of great importance to us. Most often, it just wasn't worth the candle. We weren't going to win, so we didn't push it to a vote. But on the 80 occasions when we really were very, very cross and wanted to show it, on every one of those 80 occasions, we were on the losing side. We hadn't the influence that we are now deploying. As I said, the objective was not to secure influence, but if we've gained some influence, it's a bonus. Thank you.